Let's wrap up Pride Month by talking about one of the most complicated figures in modern queer history, the man who was managing the door at the Stonewall on the first night of the uprising, Skull Murphy. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. What happened at the Stonewall Inn in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969 was not a run-of-the-mill police raid. That had happened earlier in the week, on Tuesday night. The Friday night raid was part of a larger campaign orchestrated by the NYPD 1st Division's Public Morals Unit to close every mafia-run gay bar in Manhattan. Stonewall was its biggest target, not just because it was a gay bar run by organized crime, but also because its door manager appeared to be at the center of an extortion ring targeting closeted gay men who worked on Wall Street. Buckle up, y'all. Edward Francis Murphy was born to an Italian and Irish family in 1926 and raised in Greenwich Village. Unfortunately, he started his life of crime early, beating up a fruit seller and destroying his stand when he was just 9, and then assaulting a police officer with a milk bottle when he was around 12. In that second case, though, it seems that the police officer insulted the job that Murphy had done shining his shoes and then destroyed his shoe shine box, so that glass bottle upside the head didn't come out of nowhere. Unsurprisingly, Murphy was shipped off to a reform school in Westchester County soon after, where he stayed until he was 18. He returned to Manhattan briefly and worked as a bouncer at a gay club called the Pink Elephant before enlisting in the army and being shipped off to fight in France in 1943. You might assume that a man like Ed Murphy gets a nickname like Skull by working as an enforcer for the mafia, but in fact, it was his stage name when he was a professional wrestler. When Murphy returned from the war in 1946, he went back to bouncing at gay bars, but the money wasn't great, so he bulked up through a combination of bodybuilding and steroids, shaved his head, and started wrestling as villainous Skull Murphy. He was one of the original heels. He threw chairs at the old ladies who booed him, grabbed the announcer's microphone to smack talk his opponents, and one of his signature finishing moves was a vicious headbutt. Quick note, Ed Murphy wrestled as villainous Skull Murphy for just a few years after World War II. He is not the same person as John Joseph Murphy, the Canadian athlete who wrestled as Skull Murphy in the 1950s and 60s, and he is also not Peter Northey, the British wrestler who started using the name Skull Murphy in the 1980s. They are three completely separate giant bald white dudes. Wrestling was only bringing in the medium bucks, so Murphy teamed up with 2 other men to start stealing gold shipments from dental offices. In one famous case, the dentist begged Murphy not to steal his diamond signet ring, saying that it had been a bar mitzvah gift from his father. Murphy relented, but when that dentist then bragged to the papers that he had tricked the robbers into letting him keep his signet ring, Murphy went back, beat up the dentist, and stole the ring anyway. The Toothache Bandits, as they were known to the papers, robbed nearly 80 dental offices before they were caught. Murphy was convicted of armed robbery and served 10 years in state prison. Upon his release from prison, Murphy, you guessed it, returned to the village and took work as a bouncer at multiple mafia-owned gay bars. During that time, he was known as Mother Murphy because he was extremely protective of the young runaways and sex workers who flocked to the village. But part of that protection was pimping them out himself rather than letting them be abused by worse men. I'm not defending that decision, I am simply explaining it. In June of 1964, Murphy also got hired as an in-house detective at the New York Hilton. I know that sounds wild, given his record, but the hotel said that he was placed there by a federal agency as part of his rehabilitation program. Hold on to that detail for a minute. The access that Murphy had through his Hilton job, combined with his moonlighting as a purveyor of male sex workers, primed him to play a key role in a blackmail and extortion ring that targeted hundreds of famous, powerful, influential, closeted gay men across the country. To quote William McGowan, writing for Slate, the case of the chickens and the bulls, as the NYPD called it, or Operation Homex to the FBI, still stands as the most far-flung, most organized, and most brazen example of homosexual extortion in the nation's history. This case represents an important crux, marking the first time that the law enforcement establishment actually worked on behalf of victimized gay men instead of locking them up or shrugging. The chickens and bulls scheme was simple in execution and devastating in impact. When wealthy, closeted gay men traveled to cities like New York or Chicago, they often sought out the services of young male sex workers. Those sex workers, known as chickens, would get their marks alone in a hotel room, and then one of two things would happen. Either the bulls, corrupt police officers or people impersonating police officers, would burst into the room and catch the mark in flagrante and demand money to stay quiet, Or the chickens would steal the marks' wallets and turn them over to their handlers, allowing them to gather enough information to successfully blackmail their victims. Bulls would then travel to the victims' homes or places of business and threaten them with outing or arrest unless they paid enormous sums of money. And I don't mean that the bulls lurked in parking lots and made threats from the shadows. In one case, they pulled a prominent surgeon out of an operating room in the middle of a procedure, and twice they walked a sitting congressman out of his office on Capitol Hill. Victims who couldn't or wouldn't pay had their lives destroyed. U.S. Navy Admiral William Church took his own life rather than risk losing his commission. Skull Murphy was one of the bulls and widely believed to be the leader of the entire operation. He was arrested in August of 1965. He pled guilty when he was indicted. And then Edward Skull Murphy, a convicted felon with a rap sheet a mile long, got 5 years probation for his role in a blackmail and extortion ring that operated in dozens of cities and destroyed hundreds of lives. The official story is that Murphy received probation in exchange for turning state's evidence. But in a 1978 Village Voice interview in which Murphy decided to spill all of his secrets, he said that he was working for the FBI, that they are the ones who placed him at the Hilton to help break apart the ring that was already in operation. Is it true? Possibly. It's also possible, verging on probable, that he was the ringleader of the entire operation and that both J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson had gotten caught in his net of extortion, making him untouchable by any law enforcement agency. Being protected by the FBI, either as an informant or an extortionist, would explain why Murphy's behavior didn't change at all after the whole chickens and bulls thing. He continued to work as a door manager at various gay bars, regularly liaising with dirty cops and mafia members to keep those businesses running smoothly. In 1969, at the request of Interpol, the NYPD was investigating a flood of stolen bonds that had surfaced in Europe. They suspected that the mafia was pressuring closeted gay men who worked on Wall Street to steal the bonds, and they further suspected that the mafia was getting the names of those finance professionals from Skull Murphy, who had access to Stonewall's member records. Because remember, Stonewall was skirting some of the laws against gay bars by being a private members-only club and not a public bar. Arresting Skull Murphy and searching Stonewall for evidence of blackmail and stolen bonds were two of the primary goals of that raid, and the cops failed entirely. Murphy was arrested, but he managed to escape while he was still handcuffed, and he took a cab to an S&M bar because he knew that someone there would have a key to open the cuffs. In fact, no one was ever arrested or prosecuted for the stolen bonds, Murphy included. But a whole bunch of gay and bisexual men did lose their careers in the financial services industry when the state mandated that anyone working with bonds had to be fingerprinted, exposing every man who had ever been targeted by the police for being gay. So you can see why many queer men, especially the affluent and powerful cis white ones who were the targets of his extortion and blackmail, did not like or trust Skull Murphy. But after Stonewall, Murphy did what can best be described as a complete 180. He still worked the door at gay bars, but he also threw himself into activism, and he founded the Christopher Street Festival Committee, successfully lobbying to have the route of the parade changed so that it ended in the Village, where queer businesses would benefit from the crowds, and where the most marginalized members of the community could still enjoy the celebration, even though it wasn't safe for them to march through the city. He did enormous amounts of volunteer work with homeless youth, sex workers, trans people, adults with developmental disabilities, and eventually with AIDS patients. He was even named New York State's Volunteer of the Year in 1977. And in perhaps the most inexplicable turn of all, Skull Murphy worked undercover for the New York State Select Committee on Crime until 1978, using his position as a doorman at gay bars to help bring down, in his words, pimps and scumbags. Late in his life, when an interviewer asked Murphy if he was trying to make up for the bad that he'd done with good deeds, Murphy said he didn't see it that way. "My past is behind me. I was a crazy kid. I did crazy things." Edward Francis Skull Murphy died of AIDS, February 26, 1989, at the age of 63. His funeral at St. Veronica's was standing room only, and the priest is said to have remarked, "If Ed Murphy is not with God, then there is no God." That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.